I'm a retired physics professor. Retired meaning I was tired over and over and over again. And I'm used to talking to 200 students. And I'm used to talking for 55 minutes. So hopefully I've gotten away from that far enough that it won't quite be that bad. Also, the group is small enough that if a question arises at any time, feel free to put your hand up and hopefully I'll see it. It's essentially going to be a slideshow with some maps and some photos and sketches of some of the buildings. And since Germantown was founded in, if I get the numbers right this time, 1683. And 1683 to 1860s, quite a few years in there. So it's going to be a gallop through the history to bring us up into that era. But hopefully you'll get a feel for why it started, how it started, and some of the major things that occurred along the way to make it what became in the 1860s. I don't want to talk more than that, or I'll give away my talk. Yeah.
When did Germantown become integrated into all of Philadelphia as opposed to being an outlier?
You're going to have to wait.
Okay. Well, please cover that.
It's there. It's on. It's there. How many are long-time Germantowners? Nobody.
Are you including Mount
Long time. Manor. Okay, let me explain that because that's. When you say Germantown, it can mean a number of different things. The original settlement, I guess I should say, covered essentially what was today Germantown, that area, and Chestnut Hill. Then it started to break up governmentally. And at one time there was a Germantown borough. You'll see that on one of the maps. And it was a German township, which covered those three areas. And then, of course, at some point, the township was absorbed into the city, as was mentioned. At that point, before that, as a township, it had its own government, if you will, courts, things like that. As a matter of fact, it's interesting. When you stop to think about it, you come from Europe, 1683, you get this land out where there's hardly anybody. How do you get started? And you get started, of course, by a few people that take the leadership, but you have to set up everything. So they had their own local government. They had people like fence people that went around and checked fences to make sure that you had your fence properly. Otherwise, people would wander and cattle would wander and so on. So they had to do all that governmental stuff just to exist. But then as it went on, it got to be the township. And of course, there were a number of townships, Frankfurt. You know, I guess not all townships, but a bunch of them. And then at some point, the legislature in Harrisburg agreed to make the county of Philadelphia, which was a massive county initially, and then got broken up in Bucks and Montgomery and so on. But they said the county of Philadelphia and the city of Philadelphia would be one and the same. Before that, everybody knows that the city of Philadelphia was that little rectangle. South Street to Vine, Delaware to the Schuylkill. That was the city. As you'll see on one of the maps, I'll tell you this now so I can go faster. In that rectangle, the major development was where? On the Delaware. That's where all the ships came in. So most of the buildings were on the Delaware. And therefore, most of the roads that came in from the foreign rural areas like Germantown came into that city part on the Delaware. So Germantown Avenue didn't go down to where City Hall is. Germantown Avenue goes down to around 3rd Street. Ridge Avenue comes down. That cuts over towards the Delaware. So that you had this development of the city in this little rectangle. And then you had all the outlying areas, Kensington and Frankfurt, Germantown, West Philadelphia, not called West Philadelphia at that time, of course. So it wasn't until these were all absorbed by the city as one city that things really changed and it made a big impact on Germantown. Now you no longer had your own courts, your own officers, your own sheriffs. Everything was downtown. So that made a big change to Germantown. The initial settlement, 1683, came from a place, Krefeld in Europe. At that time, Europe was not like it is today. We didn't have Germany, France, and so on. We had duchies and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of a mishmash to follow back there. They came from villages in Europe. They were not farmers, even though they needed farmland to sustain themselves. So when they developed the place and landed it, they did it this way. This is a surveyor sketch, early 1700s actually. And I apologize, but he sketched it with north at the bottom. So what we know is Wayne Junction would be at the top here and Chestnut Hill would be farther down on the bottom. What they did, they had 50-acre lots to give out to the parties. They made them these long, narrow lots so that everybody had a place on the main road. They wanted to create a village, not farmland. You needed enough land to have your own sustenance farm, but you also wanted to be with everybody else. And for example, there's Marketplace, the center of the town, basically. Okay. Here's a sketch of it. Volunteer, this is a little bit later than after they got settled in, but a firehouse, a market shed, although it was not really ever used completely as what we would call a market. Okay. Here's again, about almost 100 years later, and as I was saying before, here's the city of Philadelphia. All the buildings along the Delaware. And here's Germantown, a little village. And Germantown Avenue would come down to here, and Ridge Avenue comes down here. But notice, not much in between. So it wasn't like, go from village to village to get out there. It was quite a trek to try to come from Germantown into Philadelphia or Philadelphia back to Germantown. Okay, that's an idea of what the terrain would look like. Because it was a place where a lot of farmers out in, say, what we now know as Montgomery County would bring their goods into Philadelphia. It was a good stopover point. So it developed a lot of taverns and hotels for the carriages and the people to come in. The other thing about it, and initially it was a German town, spoke mostly German, churches in German. In Philadelphia, of course, it was English. And for a time, there was a lot of conflict. They're trying to coordinate those two. Benjamin Franklin even got involved in trying to worry about the fact that they should really learn English up there because this is an English country. The other thing by that time, it became a place for summer homes for the people that were down in the city. You know, Germantown is about 200 feet higher than the center city. So it was cooler in the summertime, not as built up, and so on. So a number of the wealthy people in the city would build a home out here. Those homes, a lot of them by what we call Wissahickon schist, the local stone. And of course, they had large estates. If we look at an example, one of the houses, this is Grumblethorpe, still in existence down on Germantown Avenue below Chelten. A summer home built by John Wister. Very, very nice summer home, of course. Okay, let's look at one of the taverns. This is the General Wayne Hotel down at Germantown in Mannheim. Again, the building's still there. There were, as I say, a number of these hotels going down there. This was built in 1803. The second proprietor was John Bacchius. I had to get that in. The other thing it was noted for, and this will come up very shortly, this is one of the places where they sold the stock for the first railroad that they put in. It was a sellout that first time. Okay, go on. The early churches were obviously related to the churches that the families had been in Europe. So we have the Quaker, you know, they came because William Penn had gone to Europe and back up. He was given all this land and he wanted to make money. So he sold land and went through Europe to proselytize basically how nice this land was, and also that it would be, I'm not sure the right word, free religion. It didn't matter what religion you were in, you were welcome to come to the land. So the early ones were the Quakers and the Mennonites from that area. The other early churches, the German Reformed down at Market Square, eventually became a Presbyterian church, and Market Square Presbyterian, and is now impacting your world church. St. Michael's Lutheran up north of the center of Germantown, and it's actually the mother church of the Brethren in this country. And again, those are still operating churches. The big impact that came after that, after the 1700s, that impacted Germantown was the railroad. This came in 1832. What it did, of course, was make it a lot easier to get in and out of Philadelphia, a lot more efficient to carry your goods in and out. But the other thing that had, not directly with the railroad, but associated with it, was the fact that that was the era of steam coming into play. Before that, it was mostly water. So the mills that you had to do to grind your flour, all that other stuff, that was on the Wissahickon, on the west side, on the Wingahocken Creek, on the creek or crick, depending on where you come from, on the east side. But now with steam, you didn't have to have a mill on the water. So this created a number of multiple mills in Germantown. And the other thing that they came to be very popular for was woolen mills. They were weavers to start with. Matter of fact, the seal that they started, that Pastoria started very early, had a weaver's needle on it, kind of thing. But they were weaving in their houses and trying to sell things that way. These people came along now and said, no, we're going to build a big mill, get all your people together, and man, we can churn out the wool. So we got much larger mills and more spread out from what it was before. And of course, since the railroad came up on the east side, if you have all these mills, you need places for workers and things to stay. So big development on the east side. So basically, yeah.
I think you may get to this, but that railroad line in 1832, is that the current Chestnut Hill East line?
Current Chestnut Hill East. It'll come up in a map. Yeah. Here's the first railroad train. This is the Philadelphia, Germantown, and Norristown Railway. The first was from Philadelphia to Germantown, then they were going to cut across the Wissahickon and go on up to Norristown. My view, I'm glad it didn't happen. Probably would have made a mess out of Wissahickon. But they never did get that other extension done. Quite a steam engine there. Okay. All right, here's an 1851 map, and again, this is Main Street. Here's the railroad coming up and coming into Germantown Avenue at Price Street. That was the end of the line. Then this shows a possible extension up to Chestnut Hill, which was not there in 1851, wasn't used in 1851. But we still see, all the building along Germantown Avenue. And so it hasn't changed much yet, but basically with the development that's going to come because of the railroad, it's going to not be a village anymore. It's going to be spread out, and the developments are going to spread out. Okay, here's what somebody was asking about before. 1854, Germantown was absorbed into the city of Philadelphia. At that time, we had 6,500 inhabitants. Now, I got to be a little careful with these, when you look up these numbers. What was that time and what is now is a little bit different. So the 22nd ward, which it became, was larger than it is today. But as I say, it went from a local government to an external part of Philadelphia, and all the courts and stuff were down there. The railroad was extended to Chestnut Hill that year. Chelten Avenue was opened in 1855. There was no Chelten Avenue before that. And it wasn't really developed until about the 1860s, and the first streetcars came in. So now it's getting more like our populated towns that we're familiar with here. In order to put in Chelten Avenue, they had to tear down some of the houses on Germantown Avenue, put that through. Okay, the other big thing that came along after that then was the Civil War. That had a big impact on the whole country, of course. There were two temporary military hospitals, one in Chestnut Hill called the Maurer Hospital, and one in Germantown called the Cuyler Hospital, which was right behind the town hall. And I'll show you the picture of that very shortly. And of course, the mills now got on the bandwagon with, if you're going to fight a war, you're going to need lots of stuff. So they were providing a lot of blankets and clothing to the military. If we look at the 1865 directory, it gives you a pretty good idea of there. A lot of churches. Now again, this is for an area larger than what we now call Germantown. Only one public school so far. Well, the public school system didn't come into play, for a while. There were, of course, what we would call private schools. Matter of fact, the first one, the Union School, was developed or started in 1761. We then know that later as Germantown Academy, down on what was because of that, Schoolhouse Lane. Right? And shortly after that, there was another school developed. Well, first let me talk about Union School. 1761, roughly 100 years after Germantown started, the school was split into two parts. There was a German school and an English school. So it's 100 years later, and still German language is an important thing. A few years after that, the people up north being Washington Lane and so on, from down there, decided that, especially in the wintertime, it was too far for kids to go. So they started their school called the Concord School. And that, again, is still, building is still there today. No libraries means no libraries as we know them. There were individuals that got together and formed a library association in order to have libraries. No hospitals, because this is after the Civil War. Those were temporary hospitals. They were closed. But as we will see when we look at some maps, there were a lot of doctors around. So they finally started a new hospital, and shortly after this, Germantown Hospital came into existence. Two cemeteries, the upper burying ground, which was next to the Concord School, the lower burying ground down near Logan Street or Lindley Avenue. And actually, there was a third part. And it probably is not listed here because it was, at that time, considered administered by the lower burying ground. That was the Potter's Field. They put some land on the west side, out of the major district where people were, and made a Potter's Field for strangers, Negroes, and mulattoes. Now that Potter's Field, after a while, got lost because no one really was, there to take care of it. And even recently, there was some furor with the housing authority. They're going to develop that ground down there. Became a playground temporarily. Okay, they have their own banks, one insurance company, and to me, what's very important, they had one newspaper, right, the Germantown Telegraph. Okay. If we look at licenses issued, and again, this is the 22nd ward, so it's a larger area than what we consider today. Just point out some of the, what to me are important things. Boy, they must have ate a lot of meat back in those days. It's interesting, they talk about butchers and butchers with cart. All right? A lot of course, retail people, and they must have liked to drink. They were carrying on the tradition from colonial days. The water wasn't safe to drink. They had to drink something else. 10 hotels still. A lot of manufacturers, a lot of mills, among other things. And a lot of doctors left over from the Civil War, I expect, but they wanted to stay. So that gives you some idea of the kinds of activities that were going on in Germantown. Okay, we're going to look at two maps. Unfortunately, we don't have an 1865 map to look at with a lot of detail on it. So here's the 1851 that we showed before. Again, basically just along Germantown Avenue. And then if we look at 1871, and I warn you, don't try to look at details yet. All right, there's an awful lot of detail there. Just try to compare. All of a sudden, here's a little development out here. We'll look at that later. A lot of development over here near the railroad. And now on the west side, up here in the northern section, development starting. Development's the way it does today. You have a big estate, some developer comes in and says, I'll buy that estate and chop it up. Or what happened before this, of course, some wealthy people from downtown would come in and say, give me this piece of it, I'm going to build my summer home there. And then the developer would take that piece and lay it out for individual homes or houses. This, by the way, is the Montashoney or the paper mill run that goes down to the Wissahickon. The railroad has now gone on to Chestnut Hill. So now let's go on and look at some of the details of this and what we're going to do. Wait, back up just a minute. I'm going to show you what we're going to do. We're going to start over here. Notice, here's Chelten Avenue. There's no Chelten Avenue on this side. So we're going to start west of Germantown Avenue, below Chelten, and go over and up the east side and back down the west side. And look at sections of the map, because then you can see some details. Okay, here's far west from Germantown Avenue. Notice this is part of the Calder farm. So it's part of the estate, but some guy named Patton bought this land and developed it into small houses. And here's the Potter's Field. Right? And the other important thing I'm going to point out is that residence there, E.W. Clark. We'll come back to him later. Okay. Going from there over towards Germantown Avenue, just to orient, this is school, well, it's called School Street then, but what we know is Schoolhouse Lane. Here's Germantown Academy. Here's the Friends Meeting House on Calder Street. And here's one of the doctors. Probably some others somewhere. Okay, go ahead, let's go on. If you go a little farther south on that side of Germantown Avenue, we see again developments here that took over, but here's still some large blocks that haven't been developed yet. Here's a nursery. This was another nursery. Here's the General Wayne Hotel that we showed earlier. So it's starting to develop on the west, but not quite as heavily as the east, as we go to the east side. Here's the east side of Germantown Avenue. Row houses. All right, before that, the big estates had individual houses on the lot. Again, for workers. We have, let me get my cheat sheet here. Here's the Methodist Church. Here's the Germantown Telegraph newspaper. Down here is the dye works. And here's one of the doctors, Dr. Armstrong. So we see that, a lot more development. because the railroad was on that side. This, by the way, is part of the Worcester estate, and this is Grumblethorpe that we saw earlier. Okay, let's move up a little ways. Oh, I'm sorry, this is a picture of the telegraph office. Okay. We go over to the railroad. This is the Wingahocken Creek. And we see again mills up here, a mill over here, a mill used to be over here. Here's Germantown Hospital as it started. And this is the Fling Mill. If we look at the picture of that, you can see a very large kind of mill that they developed. And I think some of that building is still there. Okay, let's move up.
What were they milling?
Those were, I think, woolen mills. Woolen. Cloth. Stockings, socks. All right? The mills that we normally think of, the flour mills, the grist mills, and so on, would not have to be this large in general. Okay, we move up along Germantown Avenue. This is Mill Street, which led over to the large mill off the map, now called Church Lane. Because here's the Market Square Presbyterian Church. Here's the St. Luke's Episcopal Church. There are also a number of mills that you can still see here. Some of this, it's a large mill. There's a mill in here. So the east side is really very well developed. Now we come to, here's Chelten Avenue. Railroad coming into Price Street Station. Again, you notice large mills. Here's a mill. There is a Baptist church in here somewhere, right up there. And there are a bunch of doctors around. I won't bother pointing them out, but there's doctors in each one of these. Okay, let's go move up a little farther. Here's Price Street on there. Now we have St. Vincent de Paul Catholic Church. We have Haynes Methodist Episcopal Church. We have somewhere over here St. Michael's Protestant Lutheran Church, different from the St. Michael's on the avenue. But notice how compact the building is. Right? So this has been split up, a number of ways. There's a doctor up there, which is, well, this is the estate of Butler, and that became the site of Germantown High. He didn't want to sell his land, but they convinced him he should. Okay, let's move up farther. Oh, that's a picture of the Butler estate. Let's go on. Okay, we're getting up near Washington Lane. Here's a famous name, Pastorius. The agent for the people that came over initially was Francis Daniel Pastorius. He was educated, spoke many languages. He was basically the lawyer and the secretary and so on of the town initially. So this is one of his descendants. Here's another Dr. Reaver. Here's the upper burning ground, called Axes as well because he's one of the early superintendents. And next to it, or to see, is the Concord Schoolhouse. But notice as we go north away from Chelten Avenue, it opens up a little more. Not quite as many places there. The other thing is this is nice. Well, here's Nice and Samuel Nice, and that became, was a cabinet maker, but he became Kirk and Nice undertakers at that point for a long time, but not now. Okay, anything else I ever point? I guess not. Okay. Here's a sketch of this Concord Schoolhouse, and next to it is the upper burying ground. Go farther north, here we have the famous Chew House, or Cliveden, or Cliveden, depending on your whatever. A central point in the Battle of Germantown. His reenactment, I guess, is about 2 weeks away. The first Saturday in October, they still reenact that part of the battle. The thing that I want to point out, it was not the Battle of Germantown. The Battle of Germantown went from way over in Limekiln Pike over to the Wissahickon. But it was a central piece of the battle because that's where the Americans got trapped into trying to retake the Chew House from the British, and therefore their attack, which was supposed to go down to below Chelten Avenue where the British Army was, just sort of fell apart. And this was the time before cell phones, so communication was kind of tough, and the whole thing just sort of collapsed. There's Uppsala, as we call it now, across the street. There was a mistake in the paper a week or so ago. Uppsala was not built until 1792. So it wasn't there during the Battle of Germantown. But that's where the Americans did set up their artillery to try to attack the Chew House. Here's a Baptist church. I'll mention that again later. Well, okay, that's...
Excuse me, there's a school down here. Do you know what school that is?
That's a private school, I think. It might be Alcott, because he was Alcott, not Louisa May, but the father. He was in Germantown and
Alpha?
yeah, Alcott,
Louisa May?
her father.
Yeah, Watson? Okay.
We adopted Louisa May, but she wasn't here for just a couple of years after she was born. Then went back to New England. So, okay, let's go to the next one. Here's again, we're going west now from the side of Germantown. Notice again, it was part of a big estate, the Johnson estate. And now, you notice, this is 1871. Somebody is developing that land. And it's put out, it looks like, more than 68 lots. Notice that the streets that are dashed are not in yet. They're planned, but not completed. There's a, let's see what else is here. Anything else here? A lot of Wisters. Nursery. Okay, let's go on. Coming down a little bit from that, here's a famous house called the Johnson House. Still there, famous for being one of the stops on the Underground Railroad. Again, you're starting to see more development going west from the avenue. And I like to look at these maps and look at all the names. But we don't have all day. Here's a doctor. Okay, let's go on. Here's a photo of the Johnson House. Okay, we're coming down now towards Chelten Avenue. Here's Chelten Avenue in the west part. This is a poorhouse. Early on in the 1700s, the community, again, at that time was this, governed themselves. People got together and sold, I guess I was going to say a lottery, but that's not true. Collected money to form a poorhouse for people. This is actually the second version of the poorhouse. I'll show you a sketch of the first version shortly. But no, what else can we find out? Here's a hotel. There's a hotel. We have somewhere I missed a couple of, well, let's see. All right, let's go to the next slide. Well, that's the old poorhouse on what is now Rittenhouse Street. Okay. Here we come to Germantown Avenue. Here's what we call the town hall. It's not the town hall, it's there. This was the first town hall, built far back from the avenue, and it was behind the town hall where the hospital for the Civil War was put. Then they put a new town hall in front of it, and that's that sad-looking place down there on Germantown Avenue, unfortunately. We see names like Pastorius again. Here's spotter. Here's another doctor over here, another doctor here. And over on this side, here's the First Presbyterian Church. I call it their first incarnation. They split off from Market Square and built a church here, and then they were going to move down to Chelten Avenue, where they are now. Okay, let's go on. Here's the photo of the town hall, and then this is the hospital behind it. Okay, here we go down Rittenhouse there. Worcester House is now Vernon Park. All these buildings here are gone. We have, I'll go over here first. Here's the Germantown Savings Fund, one of the two banks. This is Langstroth Hall. And Langstroth, you'll see his name here, and over the end of it over here. He's the one that developed a lot of stuff along Chelten Avenue. But for your purposes, that's an important place. Right? Because down here we have this church, built in Germantown and Greene Street and Chelten Avenue. Next to a planing mill and a lumber yard. It was, anybody know what year it was built?
Congregation was formed in 65.
Yeah. It started in 65. The building was not finished then, but it was started then. And before that, then they had services over here in Langstroth Hall. Okay, let's finally get to the meat of the thing, I guess. Here's a 1865 newspaper item. November 65, talking about that Unitarians were going to have a church service in Langstroth Hall. Oh, I'm sorry, in Town Hall at that time. If we go to the next one, it wasn't until July of 1866 that the cornerstone was laid for the church. And you'll notice one of the names here, U.W. Clark. That was that place we saw way back when. He was a banker down in Philadelphia, but he had that, I'll call it a house, down at Schoolhouse Lane and what we now call Wissahickon Avenue. And he was very important in the development because he was sort of one of the leaders of forming the congregation. And they went through him to buy the lot. We now know that location as Clark Park. It's now a park, right? But where the E.W. Clark lived. Newell was the first pastor or minister. There was some question moving into Germantown. I don't know what the word is, I don't want to be too harsh. And yet, here we are 200 years later, there's people still fighting over whether or not the religion should be there, I think. So that was kind of interesting to me. Okay, let's go to the next paper. September of '86. July was the cornerstone. It mentions 3 churches. The Baptist church, which we saw on one of the slides up near Upsall Street, the Unitarian Church, and the Methodist Episcopal Church, which was down near the Germantown Telegraph office. All 3 of them have construction going on now. Of course, for the Unitarian, it was the initial construction. For the Methodist Episcopal, it was the second building there, which happened, of course, with many of the churches. The German Reformed Church, which turned into the Market Square Church, which turned into the Impacting Your World Church. That building there is the 3rd building on the site. So as things especially expanded, they have put up new buildings. But I thought this was a very complimentary newspaper item. These will be all handsome structures. Okay, let's go on. November of 66. I'll let you read that. Again, ecclesiastical architecture. And notice now, because of some of the, what he here calls a misunderstanding, right? Then they had, lectures given to the populace to try to convince them that they should understand. Okay. This is a much later photograph, obviously, because of the cars and the trolleys of Germantown, Chelten. And this is Langstroth Hall, where the early services were held. Okay. All right, we come to 1867, April, the dedication of the church. And notice people from New York, Brooklyn, Chicago, Boston, all right, all came down to take part. Okay. Okay, here again is a later version of the church because of the automobiles. If there's some antique dealer in the crowd, they can tell me what year it would have to be. My guess is somewhere around 1920. I like this thing too.
That's the Unitarian Church? That's the Unitarian Church.
That's the Unitarian Church at Chelten and Greene. All right, this is Chelten Avenue here. This is Greene Street. And again, it's such a wide street because they initially wanted it to be a market street with markets down the center. They never did do that. It's wide enough that they could put in a cop to direct traffic out in the middle of the street. Okay. Here's the interior of the church. I have to get my cheat notes here for a moment. This is 1867. In 1870, there was a fire in that planing mill next to it. It did some damage to the windows and the organ, but fortunately not to the structure itself. Okay. Oh, wait, before we go. This was 1867. 1926, what happened? Well, it didn't happen just then, but anybody know? Came up here. All right? Early 20s, they decided when the building was finished, yeah. What do you do with this place? It was sold to the George Allen stores. They had a store down on Chestnut Street. By this time, Germantown is getting to be a drawing card. And Germantown Chelten became, after this, a big business director or session. Well, what do you do with all this stuff? Right? Well, the pulpit and the things in the rear of the pulpit came up here. Right?
They're kind of first church now. I think they're first church. The wainscoting.
Oh, I'm sorry, First Church. I'm sorry, they went down to First Church. What came up here were these two, at least, the stained glass. Right. The rest of the stained glass is new. All right, but this is from down there. Yeah, there's both these.
What about behind?
I'm not sure about that. It might be.
Here, you can see the single one that says up there. Is that gaslight or electricity?
1867. My guess is
It's probably gas.
probably gas, yeah. Although I don't see getting the gas to it is not going to be easy. Gas was, well, it's a side issue. Dangerous stuff. What they used to have in a lot of the houses was a meter at the front of inside the house, and you wanted some heat, you put a coin in, and it would run for so many minutes. Some of the problem is that, I don't know how it operated, but a lot of people were killed by the flame, cutting off, and the gas still coming out. So, dangerous kind of stuff. Okay, the other things that I found interesting, the organ, go back. The organ went to First Wesleyan Methodist Church at 15th and Lombard Street. And the pews went to the Second Adventist Church at 15th and Reed. Both of those churches were African American churches. Right? So they tried to use as much as they could somewhere. Okay, let's try. Okay, they've opened up, now they, again, are trying to counter the atmosphere. And well, it's hard to, delve into that. But I think it was more official church resistance than populist resistance. But that's pure guess on my part. Also knows you stole a Methodist preacher. Okay, there we go. All right, here's another view of the church down there in the wintertime. And this leads me to my concluding comment, which will go to Architecture is Frozen Music by Goethe. I thought very appropriate for the building down there and the building here too. Okay. I hope you know something about Germantown now.